The phone buzzed against the wooden nightstand, its vibrations slicing through the silence of my darkened room. I glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. My heart skipped a beat as his name lit up the screen, casting a pale glow on my trembling hand. Why now? Why this hour? Hello? My voice was hoarse, a blend of exhaustion and unease. There was a pause. Not the kind of silence that gives you comfort, but the kind that stabs at your chest and steals the air from your lungs. Then, his voice came through, low and deliberate, as though every word carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. I need to tell you something. His tone was steady, too steady, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times before dialing. I sat up, clutching the phone like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. What's wrong? The question spilled out, even though I already felt the answer lurking in the shadows. I'm getting married. The words hit me like a freight train, shattering the fragile world we had built together. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't even blink as the room seemed to collapse around me. My mind raced, replaying the months of stolen glances, whispered promises, and nights where time felt like it belonged to us and us alone. Married? The word tumbled out, jagged and raw. To who? To her. His answer was almost a whisper, as though saying it out loud might make it less real. But it didn't. It only made it worse. Her. The shadow that had loomed over us from the very beginning. The woman he mentioned in passing, always carefully avoiding details. The one I told myself didn't matter because he was here with me, not her. The one I had foolishly convinced myself wasn't a threat. I laughed. It wasn't a sound of joy or amusement, but the hollow, bitter laugh of someone teetering on the edge of disbelief. You're getting married, and you thought this was the best way to tell me? I didn't know how else to do it, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. Good. I wanted it to hurt him. I wanted my pain to echo in his chest the way his words were tearing through mine. You didn't know how else to do it? My voice rose, the anger bubbling to the surface. How about not doing it at all? How about being honest from the start? Or did you think I wouldn't find out? It's not like that, he said quickly, his tone shifting to desperation. I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't plan for us to happen. Us. The word stung more than it should have. Was there even an us? Or had I been clinging to a fantasy, to a story that was never meant to be mine? You didn't plan for us to happen, I repeated, each word dripping with sarcasm. But you planned this, didn't you? The dinners, the hotel rooms, the lies? Was any of it real, or was I just a distraction while you figured out your happily ever after? His silence was deafening. It spoke of guilt, of truths too ugly to be voiced. And yet he dared to continue, to twist the knife he had plunged into my chest. I don't want to lose you, he said softly, as if that would make it better. I still want you in my life. Are you serious? I snapped, my hands shaking as I clutched the phone. You want me to sit on the sidelines while you play house with someone else? You want me to be your dirty little secret? It's not like that, he insisted again, but his words felt hollow, empty. I care about you. Don't. I cut him off, my voice trembling with the weight of my emotions. Don't you dare say you love me. Don't you dare try to make this sound like anything other than what it is. There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear the other person breathing, searching for something, anything to say. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. I'm sorry, he finally said, the words barely above a whisper. Sorry? I repeated, my voice breaking. You're sorry? Do you even realize what you've done? What you've taken from me? I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, and I could hear the crack in his voice now, the faintest hint of regret. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. You didn't mean to hurt me, I echoed, my chest heaving with the effort of holding back the storm inside me. But you did, and now you want me to just… What? Pretend this never happened? Pretend I don't feel anything? I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I don't want to lose you. I laughed again, a bitter, humorless sound that tasted of salt and tears. You already have. And with that, I hung up, letting the silence engulf me. My hands trembled as I stared at the phone, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a 1,000-ton boulder. The tears came then, hot and unrelenting, carving rivers down my cheeks as I curled into myself, clutching my chest as if I could hold the pieces of my shattered heart together. The world felt colder, darker, and impossibly empty. I had let myself believe in something beautiful, something real, and now it was gone, stolen away by a man who couldn't decide if he wanted me or someone else. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let him have both. The first time I met him, it felt like stepping into the opening lines of a story I didn't yet know I was writing. He was sitting alone in a crowded cafe, a book in his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. I noticed the way his fingers absently tapped against the table, as though they were keeping time to some rhythm only he could hear. I don't know what made me approach him that day. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sunlight caught the flecks of gold in his dark eyes when he looked up, or maybe it was the way he smiled, as if the weight of the world lightened just enough to let him breathe. Whatever it was, I found myself sitting across from him, a borrowed confidence carrying me through the awkwardness of introducing myself. He told me his name was Daniel. I didn't realize it at the time, but he didn't offer more than that. No last name, no details about where he was from or what he did. Just Daniel. And for some reason, I didn't press. There was a mystery to him, a quiet intensity that made me curious but cautious. He listened more than he spoke, his gaze steady, as though he was trying to memorize the shape of my words. The weeks that followed were like walking on the edge of something fragile yet exhilarating. Our conversations began with coffee orders and books we'd read, and before long, they spiraled into late-night messages and shared laughter over inside jokes. He was charming but never overbearing, attentive without being invasive. He had a way of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. But even in those early days, there was an unspoken distance between us. He was careful, almost too careful, about what he revealed. When I asked about his family, he'd shrug and say something vague like, "It's complicated." If I mentioned his work, he'd change the subject, redirecting the conversation back to me. At first, I chalked it up to shyness, or maybe even modesty. It didn't feel like secrecy then. It felt like patience, like he was waiting for the right moment to let me in. We didn't label what we were to each other, not at first. I wasn't sure if I was ready to define it anyway. After a few failed relationships, I had built walls around my heart, walls I thought were impenetrable. But with Daniel, those walls didn't feel like barriers. They felt like challenges he was willing to face. One night, as we walked through the park under the glow of streetlights, he stopped and turned to me, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Let's keep this simple," he said. "No expectations, no pressure, just us." I remember feeling a pang of uncertainty at his words, but I nodded. "Simple sounds good," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. We set boundaries, or at least we thought we did. We wouldn't get too attached, wouldn't dig too deeply into each other's lives. It was supposed to be easy, a relationship without the weight of the world pressing down on it. We would meet when we wanted to, talk when we felt like it, and live our lives in between. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than that. And yet, the more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep things simple. Every stolen glance, every touch, every whispered word chipped away at the distance we had tried so hard to maintain. I started to learn his little quirks, the way he always ordered his coffee black but couldn't resist adding a sprinkle of cinnamon, the way he hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. But for every piece of him I uncovered, there was a part of him that remained just out of reach. He never invited me to his apartment. Instead, we met at neutral places, cafes, parks, the occasional hotel room. If I asked too many questions, he'd deflect with a joke or a kiss, and I'd let it slide because I was too afraid of pushing him away. I didn't know much about his past, but I convinced myself it didn't matter. What mattered was the way he made me feel, alive, desired, understood. For someone like me, who had spent so much time feeling invisible, that was enough. Or at least, I wanted it to be enough. Looking back, I realize how much of myself I ignored to make room for him. I overlooked the little inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, the way he always seemed to keep one foot out the door. I told myself it was fine, that we were building something that didn't need labels or definitions. I thought I could handle the ambiguity because, in those fleeting moments we were together, he made me feel like the center of his universe. But even then, there were cracks in the foundation, tiny fractures I chose not to see. Like the time I caught him glancing at his phone during one of our dinners, his expression darkening for just a second before he slipped it back into his pocket. Or the way he'd sometimes disappear for days without explanation, only to reappear with that same easy smile, as if nothing had happened. I should have questioned him more. I should have demanded more. But I didn't. Instead, I let myself get swept up in the fantasy, in the way he could turn an ordinary moment into something extraordinary. I let myself believe that what we had was real, even as the doubts gnawed at the edges of my mind. Maybe I thought I could change him. Or maybe I was just afraid of what I'd find if I looked too closely. Either way, I let myself fall for him, knowing full well that he wasn't giving me all of himself. And for a while, that was enough. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough forever. It started with a small, almost inconsequential moment, one of those things you tell yourself isn't worth worrying about, even though it burrows into your mind like a splinter. We were at our usual cafe, seated by the window where the sunlight spilled over the table, catching the gold band he wore on his left ring finger. Except, of course, there was no ring. Not yet. He had excused himself to take a phone call, something about work, he said. I had nodded absently, sipping my coffee and scrolling through my phone, not thinking much of it until I noticed he had left his jacket draped over the back of his chair. The pocket bulged slightly, and my fingers itched with a strange kind of curiosity. I didn't look. Not then, but the thought stayed with me. What was in there that he had taken such care to hide? It wasn't like him to be careless with anything, least of all the details of his life. Later that week, the cracks became harder to ignore. He canceled our plans for dinner with an apologetic text, something vague about being stuck at the office. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People get busy. But when I called him that evening, his phone rang twice before going straight to voicemail. It was unusual. He always picked up, even if just to tell me he couldn't talk. The next day, when we finally met up, I asked him about it casually, as though it hadn't bothered me as much as it did. His explanation was simple. His phone had died. He smiled that disarming smile of his, the one that usually melted my resolve, and I let it go. But this time, the smile felt more like a mask than a comfort. The turning point came during a quiet evening in the hotel room we often visited. We had ordered room service, the remains of our meal scattered across the table. I was lying on the bed, flipping through channels, while he sat by the window, scrolling through his phone. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, and I caught the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his thumb hovered over the screen before he quickly turned it off. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice light but probing. "You've been acting different." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, before shaking his head. "It's nothing, just work stress." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to pretend that the uneasy feeling in my chest was just my own paranoia. But something about his answer didn't sit right with me. A few days later, I found myself scrolling through his social media. I rarely did this. It always felt invasive, like prying into a part of his life he hadn't invited me into. But that day, the need to know outweighed the guilt. His profiles were sparse, almost deliberately so, with only a handful of posts and pictures. Still, it was enough to make my heart stop. There she was, a woman with a radiant smile and kind eyes, her arm wrapped around his in a picture that was only a few weeks old. The caption was simple but intimate. "Dinner with my love." My stomach churned as I stared at the photo, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place in a way I had been too blind or too unwilling to see before. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I clicked through more photos, each one a dagger to the heart. There were pictures of them at the beach, at parties, even one where they were holding hands in front of a Christmas tree. They looked so happy, so in love. And then there was the worst one of all. A picture of a small velvet box sitting in his palm, the lid open to reveal a diamond ring. The caption read, "She said yes." The room spun around me as the realization hit me like a freight train. He wasn't just in a relationship, he was engaged. Engaged. All this time, while he had been whispering sweet nothings into my ear, stealing kisses under the stars, and telling me there was no one else, he had been planning a life with another woman. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone across the room, to call him and demand answers. But instead, I just sat there, numb and shaking, as the weight of his betrayal settled over me like a heavy blanket. How had I missed this? How had I been so blind, so foolish? That night, when he called, I didn't answer. I couldn't. Hearing his voice would have been too much, the lies woven into every word unbearable. He left a voicemail, his tone light and casual, as though everything was fine, as though he hadn't just torn my world apart. "Hey, I hope you're okay. I was thinking we could grab dinner tomorrow. There's this new place I think you'd love. Call me when you can." I didn't call him back. Instead, I spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment we had shared, every lie he had told. I thought about the way he had always kept a part of himself hidden, the way he had deflected my questions and disappeared for days at a time. It all made sense now, the secrecy, the half-truths, the careful boundaries he had set. He had been protecting his other life, the one I wasn't supposed to know about. But now I did, and there was no going back. I decided I needed to see him one last time. Not to forgive him or seek closure, because what closure could there be when everything had been built on lies? No, I needed to confront him, to look him in the eye and force him to acknowledge the damage he'd done. Maybe it was selfish. Maybe it was just my way of reclaiming the power he had stolen from me. I sent him a text that evening, the words clipped and emotionless. "We need to talk. Same place, 7 p.m. It was the hotel we'd always gone to, the place that had become our sanctuary. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was the perfect stage for the final act of this twisted performance. He responded almost immediately, his reply just as brief. "I'll be there." The hours leading up to our meeting felt agonizingly slow. I paced my apartment, my emotions swinging wildly between rage and heartbreak. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to throw every ounce of pain he had caused back in his face. Another part of me wanted to break down and cry, to beg him for an explanation, as pathetic as that sounded. But I knew I couldn't let myself crumble in front of him. Not this time. When I arrived at the hotel, the lobby felt eerily familiar, yet strangely distant, like stepping into a dream I no longer belonged to. My stomach churned as I walked to the room, every step heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. He opened it almost immediately, his face lighting up in that familiar smile that once melted me. Now, it only made my stomach twist. "You're here," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. I walked past him, my movements stiff and deliberate. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Dim lighting, the faint scent of lavender, the bed neatly made. It felt like a mockery of all the moments we'd shared here, moments that now felt tainted and hollow. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said, closing the door behind me. "Of course you didn't," I snapped, my voice sharp, "because you don't know me at all." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unrelenting. His smile faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. I turned to face him, my arms crossed over my chest. "What's going on?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're seriously going to stand there and act like you don't know?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't understand." "Stop lying to me," I shouted, my voice breaking. The floodgates opened then, and everything I had been holding in came pouring out. "I know, Daniel. I know about her. I know you're engaged. I know you've been lying to me this whole time." His face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. The silence was deafening, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in around us. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No." I cut him off, my tone icy. You don't get to explain. You don't get to twist this into something it's not. I saw the pictures. I saw the ring. You've been lying to me from the very beginning. He took a step toward me, his hands raised as if to placate me. It's not what you think, he insisted. Yes, I'm engaged, but it's complicated. Don't you dare use that word, I snapped, my voice trembling with rage. It's not complicated. It's simple. You're a liar. You used me. And now you want to stand here and pretend like you're the victim? I care about you, he said, his voice desperate. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't plan to fall for you. Fall for me? I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. You don't fall for someone and then go home to someone else. You don't tell me I'm special and then put a ring on someone else's finger. He looked away, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he didn't have a response. No excuses, no justifications, nothing to smooth over the mess he had created. I came here tonight, I said, my voice quieter now, because I needed to see you one last time. I needed to look you in the eye and tell you that you don't get to have me. Not anymore. Not ever again. Please, he said, his voice breaking. Don't do this. I can't lose you. You already have, I said, the finality of the words cutting through the air like a knife. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I half expected him to stop me, to grab my arm or plead with me one last time. But he didn't. He just stood there, silent and still, as I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight I had been carrying for months, the lies, the uncertainty, the betrayal, began to lift. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was lighter now. As I walked out of the hotel and into the crisp night air, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my relationship with him. It was the beginning of something else, something that belonged to me alone. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The messages started flooding in the moment I stepped outside the hotel. At first, I ignored them, letting my phone buzz relentlessly in my pocket. But when it became clear he wouldn't stop, I reluctantly glanced at the screen. Please, talk to me. I can't let it end like this. Just give me a chance to explain. I deleted the messages without replying, but the weight of his words stayed with me. A part of me wanted to hear him out, to see if there was even a shred of truth left in his carefully constructed web of lies. But the stronger part, the part that remembered the pain of seeing that ring in the photo, refused to give in. The next day, the calls began. I didn't answer, letting them ring until they went to voicemail. His voice was always the same, soft and pleading, as if he could wear me down with his desperation. Please, don't do this. We're not finished. I can't lose you. It was almost laughable. His audacity, his belief that he could have both lives and that I would be willing to live in the shadows. I wasn't that person anymore. I wouldn't be. After a week of his relentless attempts, I finally caved. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to put an end to this once and for all. I sent him a single message. We need to talk. One last time. He called immediately, his voice trembling with relief. Thank you, he said. You don't know what this means to me. I didn't respond, cutting the conversation short with a simple, meet me tomorrow. Same place, 7 p.m. When I walked into the cafe, he was already there, sitting at our usual table by the window. His face lit up when he saw me, a flicker of hope in his eyes that made my stomach churn. I sat down across from him, my arms crossed, my expression cold. He started talking immediately, the words spilling out in a rush. I'm sorry, he said. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I held up a hand, cutting him off. Stop, I said firmly. Don't tell me you didn't mean to hurt me. You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose this. You chose her. His face fell, the confidence he had walked in with crumbling under my words. I didn't choose her, he said quietly. I didn't choose anyone. This wasn't supposed to happen. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You keep saying that, like it excuses everything, like it makes any of this okay. Do you even hear yourself, Daniel? You lied to me. You lied to her. And now you're sitting here, trying to justify it? He reached across the table, his hand hovering over mine. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I do. I didn't know how to handle it." I pulled my hand away, my chest tightening at his words. "You don't get to say that," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't get to tell me you love me while you're planning a life with someone else. Love isn't supposed to feel like this." "I'll end it," he said suddenly, his eyes desperate. "I'll call off the wedding. I'll leave her. Just give me a chance. We can fix this." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The part of me that had once clung to his every word wanted to believe him, wanted to imagine a world where he chose me and only me. But then I remembered the months of lies, the pain of finding out the truth, and the woman who had no idea what kind of man she was about to marry. "No," I said, the word firm and resolute. "You don't get to fix this. You don't get to decide that now, after everything. You made your choice, Daniel. Now you have to live with it." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "It doesn't have to be like this," he said. "We can still have something. We can start over." "There is no we," I said, my voice cracking. "Not anymore. I won't be your second choice. I won't be the person you come to when things get complicated. You chose her, so go live with her. Be the man she thinks you are." "I can't lose you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You already have," I said, my eyes filling with tears. "And if you care about me at all, you'll let me go. You'll stop calling, stop texting, and leave me alone. Because I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hurting like this." For the first time since I had met him, he looked defeated. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the table. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know," I said quietly, "but sorry doesn't change anything." I stood up, my legs trembling as I turned to leave. He didn't follow me, didn't call my name or beg me to stay. And for that, I was grateful. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, a strange sense of relief washed over me. The chapter was finally closed, the door firmly shut. It wasn't the ending I had wanted, but it was the one I needed. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally start to heal, and this time, I would do it without him. The silence I had hoped for after that final meeting never came. Instead, Daniel's presence seemed to loom larger than ever, his name popping up on my phone at all hours, his messages piling up like a storm I couldn't outrun. "I can't stop thinking about you. Please don't do this. We can figure it out." "I'll leave her, I promise. Just talk to me." At first, I ignored him, deleting each message without reading the full text. But as the days turned into weeks, his persistence grew. He began calling again, leaving voicemails that alternated between desperate and apologetic. Sometimes his tone would shift, his words tinged with anger, as if he were trying to guilt me into responding. "I don't understand how you can just walk away like this. You said you cared about me. Did that mean nothing to you?" Each word felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder of the chaos he had dragged me into. I hated that part of me still reacted to his voice, that his pleas stirred something deep inside me, a flicker of the love I had once felt, now twisted into something unrecognizable. But I refused to give in. I had drawn my line in the sand, and I wasn't going to let him pull me back into his web of lies. I needed to move on, to heal, to rebuild the pieces of myself he had shattered. And I couldn't do that if I let him linger in my life like a ghost. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the messages that had piled up on my phone, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. My hands trembled as I typed out a single reply. "Daniel, stop contacting me. If you don't, I'll tell her everything." I hesitated before hitting send, my thumb hovering over the screen. The idea of exposing his lies, of dragging his fiance into the mess he had created, made my stomach churn. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve him. But maybe she deserved the truth. I pressed send, the message disappearing into the ether. My heart raced as I waited for his response, a mix of dread and anticipation swirling in my chest. It didn't take long. My phone buzzed almost immediately, his name lighting up the screen. This time, I answered. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp and panicked. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I'm giving you a choice, Daniel. Either you leave me alone, or I tell her everything. You wouldn't, he said, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his confidence. Try me, I shot back. I have nothing left to lose. But you? You have a fiance who thinks you're someone you're not, a life you're trying to protect, so don't push me. There was a long pause, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. I could hear his breathing on the other end, shallow and uneven. You don't understand, he said finally, his voice softer now. It's not that simple. Nothing about this has been simple, I said, my voice breaking. But you made your choice, Daniel. You chose her, so live with it and leave me out of it. You're asking me to just forget about you, he said, his tone pleading. How am I supposed to do that? I don't care how you do it, I said, my anger boiling over. Just do it, because I can't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when you'll show up again. I need to move on, and I can't do that with you dragging me back into this mess. Another long silence. For a moment, I thought he had hung up, but then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, he said, for everything. I don't need your apologies, I said, my tone firm. I need you to let me go. And then, for the first time, he listened. The calls stopped. The messages stopped. For a few days, the silence felt deafening, the absence of his presence almost as painful as his constant intrusion. But as the days turned into weeks, the pain began to fade, replaced by something else. Relief. I spent those weeks reconnecting with myself, piecing together the parts of me I had lost in the chaos of our relationship. I journaled late into the night, pouring my thoughts and feelings onto the page. I took long walks in the park, letting the fresh air clear my mind. I reached out to friends I had neglected, allowing their warmth and support to remind me that I wasn't alone. And slowly, I began to heal. The weight of his lies, his betrayal, began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of strength and resilience. I wasn't the same person I had been when I met him, but I was starting to believe that was a good thing. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sunset, my phone buzzed with a single message. My heart sank as I saw his name, but when I opened it, the words were different this time. I'll leave you alone. I hope you find happiness. I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions a tangle of relief, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. And then, without replying, I deleted it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. It wasn't an easy decision to make. I had gone back and forth for days, questioning whether I had the right to interfere in their lives any more than I already had. But every time I thought about staying silent, I imagined her walking down the aisle with him, blissfully unaware of the man she was marrying. She deserved to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. I found her contact information online, one of those little details Daniel had accidentally let slip once, and sent her a simple message. I think we need to talk about Daniel. It's important. She replied faster than I expected, her tone cautious but polite. Who is this? I took a deep breath and responded. Someone who's been involved with him. Please, I don't want to hurt you, but you need to know what's been happening. Her response was hesitant but curious. Where can we meet? We agreed on a neutral spot, a quiet cafe on the edge of town. As I waited for her to arrive, my nerves threatened to overwhelm me. What would she say? Would she believe me? I had no idea how this would go, but I knew I couldn't back out now. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photos I had seen. She was beautiful, with an elegance and warmth that made me wonder how Daniel could ever think of betraying her. She spotted me and approached cautiously, her expression a mixture of suspicion and concern. You're the one who messaged me? She asked, her voice steady but guarded. Yes, I said, gesturing for her to sit. Thank you for coming. She sat across from me, her eyes narrowing slightly. What's this about? It's about Daniel, I said, my voice shaking slightly. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll just be honest. I've been involved with him for months. I didn't know he was engaged until recently. When I found out, I ended things, but he hasn't stopped trying to contact me." Her expression froze, the color draining from her face. "You're lying," she said, though her voice wavered. He wouldn't do that." "I wish I were lying," I said, pulling out my phone. "But I have proof. Messages, pictures, everything. I'm not here to hurt you. I just thought you deserved to know the truth." I slid the phone across the table, open to a gallery of screenshots and photos. She stared at it, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the evidence. Her breathing grew heavier, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes, shattering the carefully constructed world she had believed in. When she finally looked up, her face was a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve to know who you're marrying," I said simply, "and because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent." She didn't say anything for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the table. Then she stood up abruptly. "I need to go," she said, her voice clipped. "Wait," I said, rising to follow her. "There's more. I think you need to see something." She frowned, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Just trust me," I said. "If you want the full truth, come with me." To my surprise, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. We left the cafe and got into my car, the silence between us heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel her eyes on me as I drove, but she didn't ask any questions. When we arrived at the house, her confusion turned to suspicion. "What is this?" she asked as I led her inside. "You'll see," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. We climbed the stairs to the bedroom, and when I opened the door, there he was. Daniel, sprawled across the bed, looking as though he didn't have a care in the world. His eyes widened in shock when he saw us, and he scrambled to sit up. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rising in panic. I turned to her, gesturing toward him. "There's your fiance," I said, my voice cold. "And here's the man who's been lying to both of us." Her eyes darted between us, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. Before she could speak, Daniel did something I'll never forget. He smirked. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance, "now that you're both here, maybe we can work something out. What do you think? The three of us?" The audacity of his words was like a slap in the face. I opened my mouth to respond, but she beat me to it. "You're sick," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You're an absolutely disgusting excuse for a human being." He started to say something, but she cut him off, turning to me with a look of determination. "I'm done here," she said. "I don't need to see or hear anymore." I nodded, the tension in my chest easing slightly as we walked out of the room together. When we reached the car, she turned to me, her expression softer now. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me, for showing me." I nodded again, unable to find the right words. As she got into her own car and drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. Finally, it was over. That night, I blocked Daniel's number for good. I didn't need to hear from him ever again. And as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt at peace. This chapter of my life was closed, and I was finally free to move forward. The aftermath of everything hit me like a tidal wave, but instead of drowning, I found myself floating, carried by a strange sense of calm. It was as if confronting the truth, saying it out loud, exposing it, and walking away, had finally lifted the weight that had been crushing me for so long. In the days that followed, I thought about her, the woman I had met in that cafe, the one who walked out of Daniel's life with her dignity intact. She had been stronger than I expected, braver than I had been when I first discovered the truth. I realized we were both victims of his deceit, drawn into his web of lies and manipulation. But we had both walked away, and that felt like victory enough. As for Daniel, he was a ghost now, an echo of a life I no longer wanted to revisit. Blocking him had been the final nail in the coffin, severing the last thread that tied me to him. I didn't know what became of him after that day, and to my surprise, I didn't care. He no longer had power over me. He was just a lesson now, a painful, necessary chapter in the story of my life. In the quiet moments, I reflected on what had drawn me to him in the first place. I realized it wasn't just his charm or his attention. It was the way he made me feel seen, even if it was all an illusion. For too long, I had been looking for validation from someone else, believing that I needed another person to make me feel whole. But in the end, that need had only led me into heartbreak. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. I wouldn't look for love in places where honesty and respect didn't exist. I wouldn't settle for half-truths or be content with the shadows of someone else's life. I deserved more than that, and for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. The weeks turned into months, and life began to feel normal again. I started picking up the pieces of myself, finding joy in the small things. Morning runs in the park, long chats with friends, evenings spent curled up with a good book. I threw myself into my work, channeling my energy into projects that made me feel fulfilled and purposeful. It was like discovering a version of myself I hadn't known existed, a stronger, more resilient version, forged in the fire of heartbreak but unbroken. I also started setting goals for my future, not just the vague dreams I had always carried in the back of my mind, but real, tangible plans. I wanted to travel more, to see the world beyond the narrow scope of my everyday life. I wanted to learn new skills, meet new people, and build a life that was rich with experiences and self-discovery. For once, my plans didn't revolve around anyone else. They were just for me. One of the biggest realizations I came to was that happiness isn't something you find in another person. It's something you build within yourself. Love, when it comes, should add to your life, not fill a void. And while I knew it would take time to fully heal from everything that had happened, I also knew I was on the right path. There were moments of doubt, of course, fleeting thoughts where I wondered if I had done the right thing by confronting him, by walking away. But those thoughts never lingered. Each time they surfaced, I reminded myself of the pain I had felt, the lies I had uncovered, and the strength it took to put myself first. I reminded myself that I was worth more than the crumbs he had been willing to give. As the seasons changed, so did I. I began to open my heart again, not to another person, not yet, but to the world around me. I started saying yes to opportunities I would have once shied away from, attending events alone, joining a book club, volunteering at a local shelter. These small acts of courage reminded me that life was still full of beauty and possibility, even after heartbreak. One evening, as I watched the sun set from my apartment window, I found myself smiling. It wasn't a forced smile or one that masked pain. It was genuine, a reflection of the peace I had found within myself. I thought about the woman I had been when I first met Daniel, so unsure of her worth, so desperate for love that she ignored the warning signs. And then I thought about the woman I was now, stronger, wiser, and finally free. My plans for the future were simple but profound: to live authentically, to chase the things that made me happy, and to never settle for anything less than I deserved. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. I realized then that the chapter with Daniel wasn't just about heartbreak. It was about growth. It was about learning to value myself, to stand up for what I deserved, and to walk away from anything that didn't align with the life I wanted to build. And for that, I was grateful. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, I whispered a quiet goodbye to the past and turned my gaze to the future. It was mine now, unwritten, full of possibilities, and finally, truly my own.